The world had changed in a matter of days. What was once a thriving society filled with bustling cities, endless highways, and a pulse of life, had been reduced to ruins. The apocalypse had arrived, but it wasn't the kind of war anyone expected. There were no grand battles, no armies of the living fighting the undead. Instead, it was a silent, unseen war, one that had been brewing for months without anyone noticing until it was too late. It began with a virus. A virus that spread silently across the world, taking hold of its victims with terrifying speed. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a severe flu. People coughed, ran fevers, and felt weak for a few days. Doctors brushed it off as just another strain of influenza. But then, the first signs of something much worse emerged. The infected stopped dying. They didn't stay dead. They rose, not as the people they once were, but as something else entirely. Something hungrier. Something unrecognizable. James Miller, a retired military officer, had lived through more than his fair share of crises in his life. But nothing prepared him for this. He was on a routine trip to the grocery store when it happened. One moment, the aisles were filled with people, children, families, elderly couples, and the next, the chaos erupted. Screams filled the air as a woman near the deli counter collapsed to the ground. At first, James thought she had simply passed out, but the way she moved after hitting the floor was unnatural. Her limbs jerked and twitched, and her eyes, wide with terror, suddenly turned a cold, lifeless gray. Before anyone could react, she lunged forward with a growl, sinking her teeth into the nearest person she could find. Panic spread faster than the infection. Within moments, the store became a battlefield. Shoppers scrambled for the exits, pushing and shoving, unaware of the danger that lurked just outside. But James, being the seasoned veteran that he was, didn't panic. He grabbed a heavy metal cart and used it as a shield to push past the panicked crowd. He made his way outside and found the world outside in the same state of chaos. Cars crashed into each other in the middle of the streets as their drivers tried to flee, some of them already infected, and others too terrified to see the threat until it was too late. James's first instinct was to head home, but something in his gut told him that wouldn't be safe. Not anymore. With his military training kicking in, he knew he had to make a plan. He had to stay alive. The world as he knew it had ended, and survival was now his only objective. But survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about finding others, working together, and trying to piece together the shattered remnants of humanity. As he walked down the abandoned streets, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, disheveled and scared, holding a bat in his hands like it was a weapon. His clothes were torn, and his face was smeared with dirt and blood, though it wasn't clear whether the blood belonged to him or someone else. "You don't want to go that way," the man warned, his voice low but tense. "They're out there. The dead ones." James stopped, sizing the man up for a moment. "I know. I've seen them." "Then you understand," the man said with a nod, stepping closer. "I'm heading west. I heard there's a group of survivors holed up at an old factory. It might be our best shot. You coming?" James thought for a moment. The man seemed trustworthy enough, but the world had changed. Trust was a luxury, and every decision now had life or death consequences. "I'm not sure," James muttered, his eyes scanning the wreckage of the city. "But I'm not sticking around here. Lead the way." The two men began walking down the deserted street, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence that had fallen over the city. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ruined buildings. The streets, once filled with life, were now eerily empty. But in the distance, the unmistakable sound of low moaning carried on the wind, a reminder of the true enemy they were facing. The dead weren't just in the streets, they were everywhere. In the alleys. In the shadows. And for every living person still fighting to survive, there was a growing army of the undead waiting to pick them off one by one. As they continued their journey, James's mind raced. How long would they be able to survive like this? How long until they ran out of food, ammunition, or hope? But for now, one thing was certain: this was only the beginning of a silent war. A war between the living and the unliving, and it was going to be a fight for survival unlike anything the world had ever seen before. The question was, who would win? The night was darker than usual. The streetlights, once a beacon of civilization, flickered weakly as if they too had given up on the world. James and the stranger, who introduced himself as Evan, moved quietly through the streets, taking care to avoid any unnecessary noise. They were close enough to hear the faint growls of the undead roaming in the distance, but the silence around them felt heavier, more oppressive. It was a silence born from the collapse of society, a silence that spoke of lost hope, of memories fading into nothingness. Evan led the way down a narrow alley, occasionally glancing over his shoulder to make sure James was still following. He had a way about him, a quiet confidence that made James trust him more than he should have. But in this new world, trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and Evan seemed to be one of the few who hadn't lost his grip on reality. "I used to live here," Evan said quietly, his eyes scanning the dark alley ahead. "Before everything changed." James glanced at him. "Where's here?" Evan didn't answer immediately, but the question seemed to hit him harder than James expected. The man's shoulders stiffened, and he looked away, his face hardening. "It doesn't matter. Nothing matters anymore." James didn't press. There were no names anymore, no places that were safe to remember. People had become ghosts in their own cities. The world had turned upside down, and only those who adapted quickly had a chance to survive. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from ahead, and both men froze. James raised his hand to signal for Evan to stop. They both crouched behind a dumpster, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps grew louder, followed by an inhuman growl. It was one of them. The undead weren't like the movies. They didn't shamble aimlessly in a straight line. They were unpredictable, driven by an instinct to hunt and consume. The creatures were once human, but now they were only shells, nothing more than predators with an insatiable hunger for flesh. James peered around the edge of the dumpster. The figure was tall and thin, its skin pale and mottled with patches of decay. The creature's eyes glowed faintly, a dead, hollow glow. It shuffled closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally with each step. James's grip on his rifle tightened. He had been a soldier, and in moments like this, his training kicked in. His pulse quickened, but his movements remained controlled. "On my signal," James whispered to Evan, who nodded in response. The two of them had no choice but to take down the creature before it noticed them. The creature was almost upon them. Evan stood up first, brandishing the bat in his hands like a weapon. Without a word, he swung it in a powerful arc, hitting the creature square in the side of the head. The undead monster let out a strangled gurgle, its skull cracking under the force of the blow. It crumpled to the ground with an unsettling thud. For a moment, the alley was still. The only sound was the faint crackling of the nearby fire, which had been burning in a barrel for what seemed like hours. But then, as if on cue, other groans began to rise from the shadows. More of them. "Run!" James shouted. The two men sprinted down the alley, their footsteps pounding on the cracked pavement as the first wave of undead appeared. The air was thick with the smell of decay and death, and the low growls grew louder, closer. Evan led the way, weaving through the maze of alleys with a practiced ease that suggested he had been doing this for a long time. James followed closely, using his rifle to keep an eye on their rear. Each step was a risk. Each corner could hide another creature, another deadly threat. "You said there were survivors in the factory?" James asked as they ran. "Yeah, that's what I heard," Evan replied, his breath heavy. "A small group. They've got weapons, supplies, in." Before he could finish, a loud crash echoed through the alley ahead. A group of undead had emerged from a broken window, their grotesque forms blocking their path. The two men skidded to a halt, eyes widening as the creatures slowly turned toward them, their mouths hanging open, saliva dripping from their decaying teeth. James didn't hesitate. He fired a round from his rifle, hitting the closest zombie in the chest. It staggered back, but the shot did little to stop it. The creature let out a screech and lunged forward. "Get ready!" James shouted, pulling Evan out of the way just in time as the undead creature narrowly missed them. Evan swung his bat again, taking down one of the zombies. But more were coming. The alley was quickly filling up with the sounds of growling, of shuffling feet. It was a nightmare, a fight they couldn't win without a clear plan. James's mind raced. There was no time to waste. They needed to find shelter, now. He pulled Evan toward a side street, hoping for a moment of respite. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the empty road, but it was a brief illusion of safety. The streets were teeming with danger. Their only hope lay ahead, and they couldn't afford to stop moving. "Stick close," James instructed. "We move fast, stay quiet." Evan nodded, the weight of their situation sinking in. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for their very humanity. And it wasn't clear if either of them would make it through the night. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly before them, a desolate landscape of abandoned vehicles and wrecked buildings. The air was thick with the smell of burning debris, mixed with the metallic scent of blood. Every corner could hide danger, and every shadow could conceal a threat. The moon hung in the sky, a faint light barely piercing the veil of destruction that had claimed the world. James kept his eyes peeled as they hurried down the street. The sounds of the undead had faded for the moment, but that didn't mean they were safe. Evan kept pace beside him, his face a mask of determination and fear. Neither of them spoke, the silence between them spoke louder than words. They were both thinking the same thing: how long until the next wave of zombies appeared? How long before they ran out of options? "Keep moving," James muttered, trying to push the dread from his mind. "We need to find that factory. It's the only chance we've got." Evan nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "I know. But this is getting worse by the minute. How long do you think we can keep this up?" James didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't know. He had been trained for combat, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. The undead were unpredictable, relentless, and everywhere. And even if they reached the factory, what then? How many others were out there? How many survivors? And would they be able to trust them? Trust was becoming more and more rare in this new world. As they rounded a corner, they stopped in their tracks. Ahead of them, a barricade of overturned cars blocked the street, forming a makeshift wall. The air was still, but there was a sense of unease in the atmosphere, like a storm waiting to break. James raised his hand, signaling for Evan to stay quiet. They had learned the hard way that noise was their enemy. Every sound, every footstep, could bring the undead right to them. He slowly crouched down and approached the barricade, motioning for Evan to follow. They peered through the gaps between the cars, watching for any signs of movement. For a moment, all was silent. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, shuffling. The undead were coming. "Stay low," James whispered. He positioned himself behind a rusty sedan, his heart pounding as he surveyed the area. The street was deserted, but that didn't mean it was safe. There could be more hiding in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Evan moved up beside him, gripping his bat tightly. "How do we get through this?" "We wait," James said. "We wait until they pass, then we make our move." The undead were slow, but they were relentless. They didn't need to be fast, they just had to be persistent. And as they approached the barricade, their numbers seemed to grow. One by one, they shuffled into view, decayed bodies with vacant eyes, all moving in the same direction, driven by an insatiable hunger. James's fingers tightened around his rifle. He had the shot, but taking it would risk alerting the others. The last thing they needed was a fight with a horde. Evan's breath came in quick bursts, his grip on the bat tight. He glanced at James, his expression tense. "Do we fight or run?" James didn't have an answer. There was no clear path forward, every decision felt like it might be their last. But he couldn't afford to wait any longer. They needed to keep moving. The factory was still out there, and it was the only hope they had left. "Move," James ordered, his voice low and firm. "Stay behind me." They began to slip through the gaps in the barricade, moving with practiced silence. The undead shuffled past them, their attention focused elsewhere, their minds locked on the scent of living flesh. James's heart raced as he led the way, his eyes darting back and forth, always alert for any sign of danger. They were almost through when a loud crash echoed from behind them. One of the zombies had stumbled into the barricade, knocking over a stack of debris. The sound was deafening. Without thinking, James spun around, firing a single shot into the head of the nearest undead. The creature crumpled to the ground, but the sound of the shot had already triggered a chain reaction. The undead turned toward them, their eyes fixed on the living. The once silent night was now filled with growls and snarls. "Run!" James shouted, already turning to sprint down the street. Evan followed, his bat swinging wildly as he cleared a path. They had no choice now but to fight their way through the wave of zombies descending on them. The street was a maze of wreckage and abandoned vehicles, and there was no clear direction to take. James fired again, taking down 2 more zombies with quick, precise shots. He had no time to aim carefully, his instincts were guiding him now. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every undead he took down, 2 more appeared in their place. As they sprinted down the street, James spotted an alleyway up ahead. It was narrow, dark, and appeared to lead into a quiet part of the city. Without hesitation, he grabbed Evan's arm and pulled him toward it. "Here! This way!" They dashed into the alley, the sounds of the undead growing fainter behind them. But even in the silence of the alley, the sense of danger didn't fade. The factory was still their destination, but they couldn't afford to take any more risks. Every step was calculated now, every moment a battle between survival and certain death. They needed to keep moving, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was waiting for them ahead. The war between the living and the undead was just beginning, and the rules of this new world were more unpredictable than ever. The silence around them deepened as they continued down the alley, knowing the worst was still yet to come. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows growing darker as they pressed forward. Each step felt heavier, the weight of their survival pressing down on their shoulders. James's heart was still racing, his mind working in overdrive, calculating every possible outcome, trying to stay ahead of the undead. There was no safety, no certainty, just the cold reality that they were on their own in a world that had turned its back on them. James glanced over at Evan, who was visibly struggling to keep up. The constant running, the fear, the uncertainty, it was taking a toll on both of them. But there was no time to rest, no time to slow down. "You doing all right?" James asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Evan nodded, though his face betrayed the exhaustion that was starting to show. His grip on the bat had loosened, and his movements were slower than before. "I'll be fine," he muttered, though there was doubt in his voice. Just need to get to that factory." James didn't respond immediately. The factory was their only chance, the only lead they had on survivors, if there were any. But as the night stretched on, it became more and more clear that they couldn't rely solely on hope. They needed a plan, a real strategy to make it through the next few hours, let alone the next few days. "Keep moving," James urged, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. The alley was quiet, too quiet. They were alone for now, but the calm before the storm always made James nervous. It was only a matter of time before the undead realized they weren't just lurking in the dark, they were hunting. As they turned the corner, a faint light appeared ahead of them, flickering in the distance. The sight was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant there was something ahead, something to guide them. Terrifying because it meant they weren't the only ones who had discovered the safety of light. "Do you see that?" Evan asked, his voice barely a whisper. James nodded. "Stay close. It could be survivors, or it could be a trap." They moved cautiously toward the light, their footsteps muted against the cracked pavement. Every corner was a potential ambush, every flicker of light a possible illusion. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. Not now. The closer they got, the clearer the source of the light became. It was a street lamp, one of the few still standing in the city, its faint glow casting long shadows on the ground. But as they neared the light, they saw something else: movement. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a man in ragged clothes, holding a rifle. He looked at them warily, his expression guarded. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice gruff and distrustful. James stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands visible. He wasn't sure whether this man was a survivor or another potential threat, but the last thing they needed was to provoke anyone. "We're looking for the factory," James said cautiously. "We're not here to cause trouble." The man eyed them for a moment, his rifle still aimed low but ready. "Factory's a long way from here," he said slowly. "And I don't know you." "How do I know you're not with them?" James's heart sank. It was the same question everyone was asking these days. How could they know who to trust? How could they be sure anyone was truly human anymore? "We're just trying to survive," Evan spoke up, his voice hoarse from the running. "Like you." The man considered this for a moment, then lowered his rifle. "I'm not sure if I believe you. But I don't have the luxury of turning anyone away right now." James exhaled slowly, letting some of the tension leave his shoulders. "We're not here to take anything from you. We just need to get to the factory. Can you help us?" The man stared at them, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "I can take you part of the way. But we'll need to move fast. The undead are getting more aggressive. They've been coming out of the woods more frequently." James exchanged a quick glance with Evan. They couldn't afford to refuse help, not now. They had no choice but to trust this man, at least for the moment. "Lead the way," James said, his voice steady. The man turned and began walking in the opposite direction, his pace quick but not frantic. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, and his movements were calculated. Everything about him screamed survival. James and Evan followed, keeping a careful distance behind. The silence between them was filled with a mixture of tension and relief. They had found a fellow survivor, but that didn't guarantee their safety. It didn't guarantee anything. As they moved through the city, the sounds of the undead grew louder, like a distant storm rumbling in the background. The eerie growls and growls of the creatures echoed through the empty streets, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the corner. James's hand instinctively tightened around his rifle. He couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. They weren't out of danger yet. Not by a long shot. The man leading them was silent, his focus entirely on the path ahead. Every now and then, he would glance over his shoulder, making sure they were still close. "There's a hideout nearby," the man said, his voice low. "We can rest for a few hours before continuing." James nodded. A rest might be exactly what they needed, if they were lucky. But the factory was still their goal, and they couldn't afford to lose sight of it. "You know what you're doing?" Evan asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The man glanced at him, his eyes hard. "I know how to survive. That's all you need to know." And with that, they kept moving, the weight of their situation pressing in on them. Time was running out, and the silent war between the living and the undead was only just beginning. The air was thick with tension as the group continued their silent march through the darkened streets. The city was an unrecognizable shell of its former self, buildings crumbling, streets abandoned, and the faint hum of distant groans echoing from the shadows. James couldn't help but feel the weight of each step they took, each footfall in this city of death, each decision leading them closer to the uncertain safety of the factory. The man who had agreed to guide them, still a mystery in many ways, moved with a precision that suggested he had lived through many of these silent wars between the living and the dead. His eyes were sharp, scanning every corner, every darkened alley as though they were not only walking through an abandoned city but also navigating a minefield. James found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, the unsettling silence of the streets making his nerves twitch. The occasional distant shuffle of zombies kept his senses heightened, every slight sound pulling at his attention. Evan, still struggling to keep pace, caught James's attention. He wasn't as accustomed to the ceaseless vigilance required in this new world. He moved slowly, his breathing labored from their earlier sprint. The lack of sleep was beginning to take a toll on him. Every now and then, his grip on his bat would slip, and James could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the same uncertainty that plagued him. But James knew there was no time for doubt. The world they lived in now didn't allow room for hesitation. "You okay?" James asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Evan nodded, but there was something in his expression that said otherwise. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. How long before it's all over for us?" James's lips tightened, but he didn't answer. What was there to say? The truth was harsh and unforgiving. There was no guarantee they would make it to the factory. No guarantee that survival was even an option in a world ruled by the undead. All he could do was push forward into the unknown. Ahead, the guide paused, holding up a hand to signal them to stop. They had reached a corner where the street divided. To the left, the path looked more open, leading toward a cluster of dilapidated buildings. To the right, it narrowed, a dark alley with shadows too thick to see through. The faint hum of zombie groans grew louder from the left. "This way," the guide murmured, motioning to the right. James hesitated for a moment, but followed the guide's lead. The alleyway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp they had passed earlier. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the smell of smoke from distant fires lingered. Each step they took was muffled by the damp concrete underfoot. The silence seemed almost suffocating, as though the very world around them was holding its breath. As they moved deeper into the alley, James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, a deep instinct telling him that danger was closing in. The faint shuffle of the undead had stopped. But the stillness was too much like the calm before a storm. "Why are we going this way?" Evan asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "It's safer," the guide said without looking back. "We're avoiding a large horde that's been roaming the main streets." James didn't respond, but he noted the guide's words. Safer? How did he know? The streets had been silent for hours. Were they being led into a trap? They reached a narrow intersection in the alley. To the left, a small, rusted door stood in the side of a crumbling building. The guide stopped and pointed toward it. "We'll rest inside for a while," he said, his voice still low. "It's not much, but it's secure." James glanced at Evan, whose expression was still clouded with doubt, before nodding. "All right. We'll take a quick break. But only a short one. We still have a long way to go." The guide pushed the door open, revealing a dark, damp room. The air inside was musty, and the walls were covered in grime and old graffiti. But it was a safe haven, at least for now. They stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind them. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls as they made their way deeper into the room, the only light coming from a small, broken window near the ceiling. James immediately checked the room for any signs of danger, scanning the corners and examining the floor for any potential traps or threats. The place seemed abandoned, but in this world, appearances could be deceiving. The last thing they needed was an ambush. "All right," James said as he turned to the guide. "You said you know how to survive. How did you make it this far? What's your story?" The guide didn't immediately respond. He stood by the door, his back to them, his face shadowed by the dim light. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of experience. "Does it really matter?" he asked, his tone flat. "We're all just trying to make it one more day." James didn't push the issue further. The guide clearly wasn't ready to share his past. And in a world like this, personal history didn't matter much. What mattered now was survival. "We'll need to keep moving at first light," James said, breaking the silence. "No more stopping. We can't afford to lose time." The guide nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. James wasn't sure if the man agreed or if he was simply too worn down to care. But at this point, James wasn't concerned with trust. He was concerned with survival. As the minutes dragged on, the group settled into the eerie quiet of their temporary refuge. The tension in the air seemed to hang over them, suffocating. James couldn't shake the feeling that this moment of respite was nothing more than the calm before the storm. The undead were out there, waiting, and sooner or later, they would find them. The war had just begun, and the silence in the room was a grim reminder that, in the world they now inhabited, nothing could ever be truly safe. The hours dragged on, and the small room they had taken shelter in felt more like a prison with each passing minute. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind that rattled the broken window, seemed to amplify the silence around them. The air was thick, damp with moisture that made every breath feel heavier than the last. James couldn't sleep, not with the uncertainty of what lay beyond the crumbling walls, not with the knowledge that the dead were still roaming the city. Evan, however, had managed to doze off, his head resting against the wall in an awkward position. His breath was shallow, a sign of exhaustion. It made James uneasy to see him so vulnerable, but there was nothing he could do. Rest was a luxury they couldn't afford, but sometimes the body gave in, no matter how hard the mind fought it. The guide stood by the door, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on the broken window. He had said little since they entered the building, and James couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his head. His silence was a constant reminder that survival wasn't just a physical battle, it was mental too. But everyone had their breaking point, and James wasn't sure how much longer any of them could hold on. "We need to talk," James said quietly, his voice low so as not to wake Evan. The guide didn't turn immediately but gave a slight nod, acknowledging James's presence. He stepped away from the door and walked over to where James sat, his boots scraping against the worn floor. He was a tall man, his face weathered, eyes hollow from too many sleepless nights. There was an aura of quiet authority about him, but something about the way he carried himself hinted at a deep-seated weariness. James took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he said. "We all have. But what's your plan? Do you have somewhere safe to go after the factory?" The guide's lips twisted slightly, as though the question was one he had been asked many times before. He stared at the floor for a moment, the dim light catching the sharp angles of his face. "I've got nothing left," the guide said, his voice almost imperceptible, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile sense of normality he still clung to. "The factory is as good as it gets. After that, I don't know." James didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure if the man's answer was one of resignation or simply a reflection of the brutal reality they were all facing. The idea of moving forward, always looking for the next safe place, was a draining existence. It was a day-to-day battle against the creeping certainty that they might never find safety again. But James couldn't afford to give in to that thought, not yet. "So we just keep moving," he said, as if confirming a thought he had already reached. "There's no other way." The guide looked up at him then, his eyes dark with what could only be described as an unsettling mixture of understanding and exhaustion. "You don't get it, do you?" he said quietly, stepping closer. "There's no real moving on. The world as you knew it is gone. We're all just surviving until we're not." The bluntness of the statement struck James hard, and he shifted uneasily. It was true, of course, he knew it. But hearing it out loud made it even more real, more suffocating. They weren't just trying to survive. They were surviving in a world that had turned hostile, unpredictable. The undead weren't the only threat anymore. People, too, had become a danger. Trust was a fragile thing, and the odds of finding anyone still willing to help were getting slimmer by the day. Evan stirred from his sleep, rubbing his eyes and blinking as he adjusted to the dim light. James shot a glance at him, silently relieved that the boy was still with them. But even that relief felt fragile, temporary. "I've got to check the perimeter," the guide said abruptly, cutting through the silence. "Keep an eye out while I'm gone." Before James could reply, the man moved toward the door, opening it just enough to slip through. The sound of the door creaking closed was like a signal that the weight of their reality had returned in full force. James stayed in the room, listening to the muffled sounds of the guide moving outside, his boots tapping softly against the cracked concrete. The air felt colder now, the silence stretching between each passing moment. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet, unnaturally so. The city, once a cacophony of sounds, had turned into a place of eerie stillness. There were no distant screams, no sounds of shuffling feet or the grunts of the undead. It was as if everything had simply stopped. James rose from his spot and walked over to the small window. He peered through the grime-covered glass, his eyes scanning the streets below. Nothing. Just the dark expanse of the city, the occasional flicker of a broken street lamp illuminating the desolate scene. He sighed, his mind racing with possibilities. What if the undead had learned to move quieter? What if they had adapted to the quiet war that had waged for so long? He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Not now. A distant sound suddenly caught his attention, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't the usual shuffle of the undead. This was something different, something closer. He turned quickly, rushing back to where Evan had just stirred awake. The boy's eyes were wide with confusion, but James didn't have time to explain. He grabbed Evan's arm and pulled him toward the back of the room. "We need to move. Now," James hissed. Evan's eyes darted toward the door, and for the first time, James saw the fear that had been creeping up on him finally surface. There was no more time for waiting. The undead were close, and it was only a matter of seconds before the silent war turned deadly. The moment the door opened, they were ready. The door creaked open slowly, the sound sharp in the thick silence of the room. James felt his heart race as the heavy weight of the moment settled in. The faint growl they had heard earlier was growing louder, and it was clear now that whatever danger lay outside, it was closing in fast. Every instinct in James screamed to get out, to flee before whatever was approaching could find them. But there was nowhere to run, not in this city, not in this world. Survival meant standing your ground and fighting when you had to. He gave Evan a quick, urgent look. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline rushing through him. "We stick together, no matter what." Evan nodded, his eyes wide with fear, but his hands were steady as he gripped the baseball bat that had become his lifeline in this new, brutal world. The weapon wasn't much, but it was something. And in a world like this, something was often enough to buy a few more moments of survival. James turned back toward the door. The guide had been gone too long. Too long to simply be checking the perimeter. There was no way of knowing if he was still alive or if he had walked straight into a trap. It didn't matter. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The growls were closer now. Their low, guttural rhythm sent a ripple of dread through James. Whatever was outside was hungry, and they weren't going to be the only meal in the city tonight. He motioned for Evan to follow him, and together, they slipped out into the darkened hallway of the building. The alleyway outside was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint shuffle of feet in the distance. But this time, the movement wasn't from the undead. There were no zombie shuffles, no grotesque moans. This was something else, a slow, methodical march. James clenched his teeth. What the hell was going on? He pulled Evan closer, their footsteps muffled on the wet concrete. "Stay quiet," James hissed. The words barely left his lips before he froze. The sound had stopped. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to have paused. Then, in the distance, a shadow moved. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed Evan's arm and yanked him into the nearest doorway. The air in the cramped space was cold, the scent of mildew and decay hanging thick in the silence. They crouched low, their bodies pressed against the wall, barely daring to breathe as the shadows shifted outside. The growls had returned, louder now, accompanied by a low scraping sound. Something dragged along the concrete. Something heavy. Something that didn't belong. A muffled voice called out in the distance. "Move out. They're not far." James's heart skipped a beat. A human voice? Were there survivors out there? Or were they just another group trying to stake their claim in the war that had now consumed the world? "Get ready," James whispered to Evan, his hand resting on the bat, ready to strike at whatever came around the corner. His senses were heightened, his mind racing with possibilities. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. There were too many unknowns. The moment the footsteps drew closer, James motioned for Evan to stay behind him. But just as they were about to move, the voice came again, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps. "They're here," the voice called out again, and in the next instant, a figure appeared in the alley. James tensed, ready for a fight, but the figure stopped short. It was a man, tall, weathered, with a rifle slung across his shoulder. His face was obscured by the shadows of his hood, but his body language suggested that he was no stranger to the dangers of this world. He scanned the alley, his eyes darting from side to side as if searching for something, or someone. "Who's there?" the man called out, his voice harsh but not threatening. "I know you're hiding. Come out." James hesitated, unsure whether to reveal their position. Every part of him screamed to stay hidden, to wait and see if this stranger posed a threat. The man could be a part of another group, a group that had already turned hostile. But something about the man's tone seemed genuine, cautious even. He wasn't shouting to intimidate. He was simply trying to find them, to make sure they weren't about to walk into a trap. James exhaled slowly, his mind made up. "We're not looking for trouble," he called out, his voice carrying just enough to reach the stranger. "We're just trying to survive." The man's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the rifle. "Survive, huh? What's left to survive for? The world's gone to hell." James didn't respond at first. He could feel the weight of the question in the air, the deep weariness in the man's voice. They had all been asking themselves the same thing. What was left to survive for? Was it even possible to hold on to anything resembling hope in a world overrun by the undead? But there was no time for such heavy thoughts now. The growls were growing louder. The undead were closing in. "We can't stay here," James said, stepping into view. "But if you're not hostile, we could use a hand getting out of here." The man studied him for a moment, his eyes searching for any sign of deception. But after a tense silence, he finally nodded. "Fine," he said gruffly. "But you'd better keep up. And don't slow me down." With that, the stranger turned and began to walk away, his rifle held ready. James looked at Evan, and with a quick nod, they followed. There was no time to question this new ally. There was only time to survive. The silent war had begun, and all they could do now was fight their way through it. The alley stretched before them, a narrow corridor between crumbling buildings that were little more than hollow shells of their former selves. The dim light from a distant street lamp cast long shadows, making it impossible to see what lay beyond. Every step they took echoed in the eerie silence, a stark reminder that they were surrounded by danger. The quiet had returned, and with it, a sense of unease that gnawed at the back of James's mind. The stranger led the way, his rifle raised in a stance that suggested he was no stranger to the perils of the new world. His movements were fluid, deliberate, each step calculated as though he was mapping out every potential threat in his mind. The tension in the air was palpable, and James couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment, they could be surrounded. Evan kept close behind James, his eyes darting nervously from side to side, trying to stay alert despite his obvious exhaustion. The boy had seen too much already, too many horrors for someone so young. But survival was a brutal teacher, and it had already begun to mold him into someone who understood the unspoken rules of the new world. Trust no one. Fight when you have to. And never stop moving. As they moved deeper into the alley, James couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting the undead to appear out of the shadows. But there was nothing. The silence stretched on, unnerving in its emptiness. "Where are we headed?" James asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger didn't look back. "The old church," he replied gruffly. "It's safe. For now." James frowned. He had heard rumors about the church, stories of survivors gathering there, of people trying to hold on to whatever semblance of normality remained. But those rumors were always vague, always shrouded in uncertainty. And in this new world, uncertainty was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Safe?" James repeated, his skepticism evident in his tone. "How do you know it's safe? There's nothing left that's safe." The man's shoulders stiffened slightly, but he didn't turn around. It's not about being safe. It's about being alive. And that church, it's got what we need to survive. James didn't press further. The man was right about one thing: survival was all that mattered now. There were no promises of safety, no guarantees of peace. There was only the next breath, the next moment. And for now, the church seemed like their best chance. They moved quickly, crossing through abandoned streets that were once filled with the sounds of life. Now, they were silent, the buildings looming like silent witnesses to the world that had been lost. The streets were littered with debris, fallen signs, broken glass, shattered windows. It was a city frozen in time, a monument to what humanity had once been. And in this new world, there was no room for nostalgia. As they turned a corner, the church came into view, a massive, Gothic structure that loomed above the city like a shadow. Its once pristine white walls were now stained with grime and soot, its stained glass windows cracked and shattered. But despite its dilapidated state, the church still held a sense of grandeur. It was a beacon in a world that had lost its way, a symbol of something that had endured. The stranger quickened his pace, and James followed, his eyes fixed on the church ahead. But as they neared the entrance, a new sound reached their ears, one that sent a chill down James's spine. The growls. Louder now. Closer. James's hand instinctively went to the bat strapped to his back, his grip tightening as the sound grew nearer. He could feel Evan tense beside him, ready to react. "Stay close," James murmured, his voice low and urgent. But the stranger held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He glanced around the corner of the church, his eyes scanning the shadows. "They're here," the man said, his voice a mixture of frustration and resignation. "They're always here." James's heart skipped a beat. The undead. They had found them. The sound of the growls grew louder, the shuffling of feet unmistakable now. There was no mistaking it. They were surrounded. And there was no way out. The stranger turned to face James, his expression grim. "Get inside," he ordered. "We're not out of this yet. But we can't stand out here." Without waiting for a response, he moved toward the church's massive wooden doors, pushing them open with a creak that sounded far too loud in the tense silence. James hesitated for a moment, glancing at Evan, who nodded, a look of determination in his eyes. They had no choice. Together, they stepped inside, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them with a deafening crash. Inside the church, the air was cold and stale, the scent of mildew and old wood hanging heavy in the atmosphere. The interior was dimly lit, the once beautiful stained glass windows now shattered and broken, casting eerie shadows on the worn pews. The silence was suffocating. "We can't stay here long," the stranger said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "They'll find a way in." James didn't need to be told. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the knowledge that they were running out of options. The church, for all its apparent safety, was just another temporary refuge. In this world, nothing was permanent. Nothing could be trusted. The growls outside grew louder, and James's heart raced in his chest. The undead were closing in. And now, inside the church, they were trapped. The final battle had begun. And James knew that in this war between the living and the unliving, survival would require more than just fighting. It would require the courage to face the unknown, to fight when hope seemed lost. And as the first of the undead pressed against the church doors, James realized they were about to find out just how far they were willing to go to survive.